Poker's legendary champions, next generation stars, and tireless ambassadors of the game, sharing their wisdom and guiding your journey to high achievement on the green felt. This is Tactical Tuesday on Chasing Poker Greatness with your hosts, Brad Wilson and Jon Chai.
Welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson. Today is a Tuesday, which means it is a tactical day. So I am joined by my co-host of Tactical Tuesday, Mr. Jonathan Chai. How you doing, sir?
Doing good. Trying to fade Hurricane Hillary over here on the West Coast.
Really?
Yeah.
How big is Hurricane Hillary? Like, what's like affecting?
I don't know.
Like,
it's supposed to. I think it's technically supposed to be a tropical storm by the time it gets here, and not going to be downgraded from an actual hurricane. But we've been getting flood warnings in the desert for the last few days.
Nice. Good old flood warnings, raining. Well, I have a feeling you should more than likely fade it. I don't know the exact odds of it making it to you, but if it's a tropical storm, it feels pretty unlikely, right?
We got to get this episode out though before my power goes out or any of the bad stuff that's happening.
Before we get Hillary, right? Hillary 2023. All right. So what's the theme of this episode? If we're gonna go, I guess we need a theme. Yeah. It's probably not hurricanes.
No, unfortunately not. It's going to be a value betting themed episode. Kind of different from our normal value betting episodes. We're just trying to figure out like what the best size to bet is, or whether we should, bet the turn or check the turn. This is going to be a situation where I have a really, really strong hand on the river, but lots of money left in both of our stacks. A very, very high SPR, I guess, is another way to say that. And my question is, what's the best way to get all the money in? Should I check and go for a check raise? Should I just bet myself?
Yeah, I mean, okay. So like we'll cover this, I'm sure, but like I think the reality is in a lot of these spots that like you just don't get to get all the money in every single time, right? Just like you would just have to be like, okay, like it's very unlikely that we get the money in. And I think the better question is like, how do we get the most money in possible, like at the highest frequency?
Okay. Yeah. I guess maybe the way I should have phrased it is I would like to get all the money in, but the real question is what you asked is, how can we get the most money in?
You have a very strong hand and you would like to get all the money in. Wow. This is a high level episode coming your way today, folks. John has aces pre. He would like to get it all in pre-flop every single time. Whew.
Should I just jam?
Yeah. How do you? All right. So hand number one. Everybody folds to the small blind. You've got a king and an 8, both hearts. You open to 3 big blinds, and your opponent 3 bets to 9.2 big blinds, and you call. So blind versus blind action, 3-bet pot, out of position, pre-flop caller. The flop is king 5, rainbow. So you flop trips, which is a good hand. You check. There's 184 in the pot. Villain bets at 3rd. And so here we are, I guess, at decision point numero uno.
Never really considered check raising here in game. I don't know if I would have much of a check raise range at all on king 5 rainbow. Especially facing a 3rd, I think a lot of my range is just getting a really good price to peel. And I think that just in terms of keeping my strategy simple and easy to execute, my plan here would just be to have a check calling range and not think about check raising very much.
Okay. Although, I mean, check raising is, a viable option in this spot. Like I think there is a strat that you could deploy when you check raise trips here. But calling with range is reasonable as well. So you go ahead and you call this $60 bet. So now the pot is 300. Flop was king 5. Turn is the tray of spades, putting up a backdoor flush draw. You check, and your opponent checks behind. The river, you go from good to great, is an 8 of diamonds. So you make the nuts. Kinking 853 is the final board. There is no flush available. 303 in the pot, and SPR is round 3.
Yeah. So this is just kind of the quintessential spot that I want to study. It's, hey, I think a lot of the time what's going to happen is the street is going to get checked through, which is why there's so much money left behind. We're in a 3-bet pot right now with 3x pot left on the river,
which kind of goes back to the flop, right? Of like, if you did raise the flop, you would have a reduced SPR, and if you check through the turn, you can still like jam, and it's like 1.5 x-ish or whatever. So anyway,
yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, on the flop, I wasn't sure how frequently I would want to jam the river. But yeah, I mean,
I can imagine if you check raise a flop and the turn check through, you probably want to jam quite often, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Now check raise bet jam, that's a different horse of a different color.
But anyways, here on this river, I'm just sort of asking myself, is there more value to be had from just betting my nuts on the river, or is there more value to be had from checking and either letting him value bet a worse hand or bluff?
Yeah. And it's a good question. And I think like the part of me, it's my personal preference is to bet and not check. And I think that preference stems from one, and the way that you called with range, on the flopper, that's a strategy that you personally set up there. Like, I find it hard to construct an underbluffed, or even having like enough bluff check raise range. Like, I feel like your check raise range here is going to be grasping to find enough hands to like effectively bluff with, so that villain can pay off the check raise. So I think in this way, like when you check, villain's going to choose the size of the bet that's placed, and then you're going to check raise, and then like it's just really hard to get paid when you do check raise the river here with your hand and villain's range. Yeah.
You're saying it's like hard to get paid by the hands that villain might value bet if I check the river.
Correct.
Right?
Correct. Like 9s, 10s, even a hand like 6s, 7s can probably bet like a third or something on there. Like you would really like to see a small bet so that you can raise and villain can like talk themselves and like, maybe I induced or something along those lines. But if you face like a 2/3 pot bet, which is probably one of the more standard sizes, and then you jam, it's just like. Like, does aces like really call the jam on the river? Like
yeah,
they might, but it feels like they probably shouldn't. But I guess that doesn't really stop people.
Can I counter that?
Sure.
Point. So I don't know how specific this is to the 1K pool, and this might be like a very pool specific meta thing. But one thing that I am a strong believer in is that when I do go bet check bet as the big blind on this board and get check raised on the river or check jammed on the river after I value bet, let's say like my 9s through queens or pocket 6s through queens or something like that, I am really, really happy to call it off with those hands. A lot of the time, what I think I run into is that I value bet the river in that stop and go line, and then the check raise range is a range that is comprised of bluff catchers that the small blind now realizes they can't profitably call the stop and go with. And so they start turning like 5, 6 of hearts into a bluff on the river, or pocket 4s, or, ace 3 of clubs or something like that. Starts getting check jammed on the river instead of, becoming like check calls, because they either read into the sizing or the line or something like that and realize like, hey, like my low pair here isn't good enough to call anymore. Maybe I can jam and get them to fold 9s through queens or 6s through queens. And I just want to go back to the first thing you said about like, my check raise range here just being massively imbalanced towards, hands like this and not having enough bluffs or not having enough low equity hands in it. I think that's absolutely correct. Is that like, I wouldn't have very many, 5, 6s or ace 3s or just like random bluffs that I decide to check raise on the river. But I don't think that's a problem because of the current meta in the pool.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. Right. And it, what ultimately you said kind of boils down to is the level at which villain's operating on and thinking about, right? Like while that meta may exist, does villain know about that meta? Does that, like, why does the meta exist in the first place? Does the meta exist in the first place because, check raising facing those bets turns a profit with like full house blockers or like bottom pair because they're specifically, targeting, because like essentially like the big blind is capped, right? So like they're attacking what is perceived to be like a capped range. So, those are the things that I would ultimately consider there is like, why does that meta exist in the first place? Why is this back and forth happening? And is villain operating on a level where they can recognize and understand that meta to where you can check raise all in and get called by, nines or tens or whatever hand they're going to be value betting. And I think it's tricky. And there's a lot of kind of unknowables there that, you're hinging your river decision on. And with that said, like, I do think that like, you should have hands that check raise the river with that are lower in equity. And you should check some nutted hands too here on the river too, so that, you do have natural check raises with value. So again, like I think check raising is a viable path and I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think betting the river also makes a lot of sense. And it really depends on who the villain is that you're playing against or, just any sort of in-game information that you have available to you that can kind of guide you one direction or the other, because I think both tools here are pretty similar or close to EV in nature, and your tool goes up in value in certain conditions, and betting the river like 1.5x or so goes up in value under different conditions. So really just have to be able to have high awareness and recognize the conditions in which you're playing or operating in.
Right. So just to kind of just rephrase everything that you just said. So the action that you take here, whether you 1.5x the river or go for the check raise, is going to be dependent on kind of player type. What type of reg, what level do you think that this reg in the big blind is operating on? If you think that they're not the type to just bet call it off with their thin value on the river, then you'd go for the 1.5x. If for some reason there's something that leads you to believe like, hey, this is the type of player that's like really in tune with the meta and will just call off, pocket sixes after betting them on the river, then you're more likely to go for a river check raise instead of the 1.5x.
Yeah, and I mean, understanding how to discern the villain that you're playing against, I think is the tricky part. Like that's the really difficult thing. And I would say that, the first thing for the listener or the watcher on YouTube to kind of dig into is like, well, what is the average reg at your stake? What level are they operating on? So, if you recognize that like, 90% of regs are operating on the level in which you think they are, then check raising is obviously the default, right? You need like strong reasons to not check raise and to bet the river. If 10% of regs, on the other hand, are operating on the level in which you think, then betting the river is the default. And you really need to figure out when check raising all in is going to generate more EV than betting. So it really just kind of depends on the average of the people that you're playing against. If you're in an unknown pool, that's really the only way to kind of navigate in the dark or with very minimal information. So again, I think everything that I just said there is like a very long-winded way of giving the old poker coach response of like, it depends. I think that the strat that you deploy really depends on a myriad of factors.
Yeah. And my way of deciding which strat to deploy is pretty easy. I'm just always going to go for the check raise.
There you go. So you don't have to think about it. Thinking is discouraged. The Jon Chai way. So you check, villain bets half pot. And
this is such a nice size. This is like such a good size to face. I think this size is way more indicative of thin value than any other size for some reason. I don't know why. Just half pot sticks out to me.
And I think too, like this is sort of there's kind of this can be problematic from the big blind's perspective, right? Like when they check behind the turn and they bet half pot on the river, essentially what they're signaling is like they don't have the nuts anymore, right? They don't have a lot of hands that really want to put all the money in. And when they choose the small size on the river, again, they kind of plant the seed of their own demise that they can start inducing from some lower level bluff catchers. Whereas if they bet pot, right, I think it's much more difficult to convince yourself that villain is turning 5-6 into a bluff facing like pot, right? I think so essentially here they have sown the seed of their own demise where they bet half pot, and if they are thin value betting, as you said, that they create this weird dynamic where they're probably just going to call it off more than they're supposed to, which is obviously good for you. And here we go. Villain does call, and they call with 8-9 offsuit, so they rivered an 8, which, yeah, I think to be fair is not the worst of. It's just not the worst played hand. I think they played the hand pretty well. I think their 3-bet pre is a little wide, but yeah, I don't really have too many issues with the way Villain played it. I don't really have too many issues with the way you played it. Just that, when Villain does opt to go for thin value there, they do take a risk that you're not checking a lot of King X, and that when you check raise, you're not going to have a lot of like trips type hands in your range. So gives a lot of credence here to, checking a lot of your 3 oak actually in this exact situation. So anywho, well played, John. Good find. Good first hand. We'll have more thin value betting coming at you directly following this break.
Are you a lone wolf searching for the ultimate pack? The CPG Wolf program is a close-knit brotherhood hell-bent on one thing only: chasing poker greatness. Powered by bleeding-edge wolf strats and led by Coach Brad and his lieutenants, CPG Wolves are systematically prepared for almost any spot they'll encounter on the green felt. If you want to plug into an elite team and have a step-by-step game plan to realize your full poker potential, you can apply at cpgwolves.com. Space is limited, and the pack is only as strong as its weakest member. So only the hungriest, grittiest, and most driven will be accepted into the program. Applications are open at cpgwolves.com.
All right. Welcome back from the sponsored break of cpgwolves.com, the coaching for profit that both John and I run. If you'd like more information, hit up cpgwolves.com, join the Slack community, Greatness Village, and we'll go from there. But let's talk about these hands number 2 and 3, because we got a triple feature coming at you per usual lately. We're getting more 3-hand episodes in. Let's start out with this hand here. John, you want to break down the action?
Yep. So I'm in the big blind, 6-3 of hearts. Under the gun opens to $30, and the button calls. I'm obviously going to get in there with the suited 6-3.
And what's happened to you? Where did the old John go, who would have never even considered this hand in like a billion years? I don't think. He probably wouldn't call like 10-7 suited, much less 6-3 suited.
Yeah, what Brad is referencing is a very, very old coaching session where he saw me fold 6-4 suited on the button when it got folded around to me. And yeah, I think we just still haven't, or I still haven't been able to live it down, even though that was, I don't know, that was like the 200 NL days or something like that. So it's been a while, but
2 years ago. But some mistakes are just unforgivable, and that's one of them. Like, oh, this guy's folding 6-4 suited on the button now. Wow. Okay.
There's a chart somewhere out.
All right. So you call with 6 tray of hearts, closing the action, multi-way, out of position, all the factors that you would like to have. Any information on either of these villains here? The 30 open from low jack seems pretty abnormal.
Yep. I think that's pretty much all I was able to read into, but it's a big deal. The 3x open from under the gun, very, very rare. I think so rare that it's likely indicative of a weaker reg, maybe just a straight up fish. Also the button flatting the 3x open, probably indicative of something similar. Although I think the button flat is a little bit more forgivable, I guess, than the 3x open from under the gun. So can't read as much into the button flat as we can into the under the gun 3x. Oh,
Well, we get a pretty good flop. That
Yeah.
if you're a podcast listener, means John just made the nuts. Flop is 6-6-3 with 2 diamonds, 1 spade. So I can see why you brought this hand of wanting to get more money into the pot, considering this flop. You start off with a check and under the gun checks and the button checks. I guess that's kind of the first part of this equation is like you could have led the flop here multi-way.
Sure.
And probably like tends to be one of my preferences, but checking and letting it check through is another option. So flop checks through.
I just want to make it as hard as possible. Dodging would be too easy.
Yeah, just let's raise the difficulty level of this here. Flop checks through. Turn is the deuce of diamonds, so completes 4-5 suited and completes a flush. Depending on how wary John is, I guess it would also complete a straight flush. Never know about John these days. There's $95 in the pot. Do you decide to bet the turn here on the flush completer? I guess we'll start at this decision point. What's the?
Could I?
I don't know. Do you plan on betting at any point in the hand?
Okay, so I think the 4 or 5 and the flush completing, which are the two kind of big things that come into play on the deuce of diamonds turn, aren't that big of a deal. I would expect all the 4 5s and most of the diamond draws on the flop to just c-bet, or if it was the player on the button that had either of those two hands to stab. So I don't know how many flushes or straights I expect to see. I think it's actually like very, 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 very low. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna bet this turn. I don't even know if that's the best way to go about it. Should I be thinking about check raising here again, or just 1.5xing the turn or something like that? If I do that, I think the range that I am targeting is going to be like 1 diamond type hands, over pairs that check back the flop, over pairs that don't see bet the flop. I don't think that's crazy from the under the gun players perspective if they have a strategy that's doing a lot of checking, especially multi-way. So yeah, I mean that's sort of my confusion here on the turn. Is it better to check and check raise versus that range? Is it better to lead and try to get called by that range and maybe some like 1 diamond hands?
It's hard to know, really. I think this is incredibly tricky here. I have like multiple conflicting feelings about the spot. Is like, okay, so like, what are you check raising with that? What type of strategy are you deploying with a check raise when you face a bet that includes hands that didn't like that includes low equity hands that just didn't bet themselves in the first place on the turn, right? That's probably my primary one. Is like, so if you check raise, like, how are you constructing that check raise range in a way that has less equity in it than what you have when hands like, I don't know, king queen with the queen of diamonds, for instance, that may be like a check raise candidate here if you're feeling a little frisky. Like that hand just bets the turn itself most likely, right? Like on the 3 flush. So that's sort of the major problem with check raising. And I find it hard to find enough like low equity type hands to check raise with here, or maybe like your whole strategy should be to check raise so that you do have those type of hands. But from villain's perspective, I think that's where it gets kind of interesting to me, because it doesn't really matter like what your strategy is. I think what ultimately matters is how villains perceive your strategy. So I don't know. Check raising feels a bit much. I think that the natural way for villains to feel as if like their overpairs have a fair amount of equity is just to go ahead and bet yourself. And so like betting to me feels like the more viable path here on the turn. And then expecting that like, oh, if villain has like deuces full, they're probably just going to raise at some point on their own. So you still get to stack them. It doesn't really matter what you do. But really you're targeting their like overpairs. Because I mean, it's not like totally out of the realm of possibility if kings, say black kings check the flop, that they just check the turn too and don't place a turn bet. Like it's totally, even if they have like red kings that have a flush draw now, just check the turn as well. So yeah, it feels hard to get three bets in from those kind of hands. And if you check it, it honestly starts to feel kind of hard getting two bets in versus those kind of hands.
Okay. So settled on
Betting.
leading here.
Yep.
What do you think about size? That was going to be my next question. I don't go with the overbet size, which is what I maybe would have expected to see from myself or or whatever. But like, yeah, I go with a smaller size here, which I think, I mean, if I had to like kind of go back and try to reconstruct like my logic for going small here, this is a spot where I think my default size would be just very, very big. So I'm guessing that this is actually like a conscious like sizing deviation that I've made. I'm guessing what the size does is, or what I'm hoping to do with the size is just get called by way more one diamond hands that are, you know,
sure,
drawing dead. I just don't want, you know, ace queen with the queen of diamonds to fold the turn because I 1.5x it or something like that. Just put those hands into a slightly tougher spot. I think the over pairs are the region that I sort of miss out on value from by going this size instead of like the 1.5x. I think the over pairs would, especially with the diamond, are all very likely to just call the 1.5x, but they're also going to call this size. So really the only extra value that I'm really hoping to target are the one diamond hands.
Yeah, I mean, again, like I think you could use a spectrum of sizes here on the turn, and it just depends on the goal that you're trying to accomplish. And 70 is fine. I think 150 is fine. Either one I think are reasonable. I don't really have a huge preference to either one, because I think there are some like good things that happen with 72 where like, you know, villains can like raise. They can find like raises more frequently facing the 70 than the 150, and like a raise is like really, really, really good for you, like really good for you. So villains finding an extra like 4 to 5% raises, I think works ultimately in your favor. So yeah, again, I think it's close, either sizing selection. So not really, I don't have a strong preference here on the turn. For the podcast listener, just to recap everything, the board is 6-6-3 deuce with the deuce tray, 6 of diamonds, 95 in the pot, and John's three ways. And the under the gun player actually does have 160 big blinds left, so there is quite a bit of depth here. And the low jack, or the under the gun player, decides to call. So there's 231 in the pot. They have 1553 remaining, and John has them covered. River is the 8 of hearts, so doesn't really change much unless villain has pocket eights, in which case John is pretty much dusted. So again, we have river decision point here of betting, checking.
Yeah, have a hand that would like to play for all the money, as many bets as possible. We have lots of bets left behind. We're 150 big blinds effective with only 23 in the middle. And same question as the king 8 hand. Should I check the spot and hope to pick off some bluffs and some thinner value or some value, or should I just bet here and target the bluff catchers and maybe like, I guess like really the overpair region.
I mean, it doesn't, like, checking doesn't make a lot of sense here once you like bet multi-way on the turn and polarize. Like, I think that, betting makes the most sense rather than checking. And again, I think I would just continue polarizing and go big. We talked a little bit about, the profile of villain, whether they're like a white belt or like a weak reg type opponent. And I don't know that that's really come into play a ton here, but yeah, I would just continue polarizing and kind of thinking that like villain will do a lot of like checking back with a lot of bluff catchers and forego like some of their thinner value bets, or like, I don't even know what a thinner value bet would be here, like tens or jacks. Maybe they can't resist betting tens and jacks and just like get check raised. So now I'm waffling a little bit.
That's what I was hoping for, was that like the hands that I'm targeting, the hands that I would hope to call if I bet big on the river are mostly just going to be the overpairs that check the flop. Like you said, the jacks and tens. You could definitely even have, aces, kings, and queens. That wouldn't be shocking. The
biggest danger, right, is like if they are thinking tactically with a hand like jacks, right? When you polarize a turn, you're going to have very strong hands and not very strong hands. And so betting the river with like tens or jacks versus a polarized range, I think is a pretty critical error by the in position player reopening the action, in the same way that like the previous hand where they reopened the action when they were capped and just basically like dared you to jam. I think it's I don't think it's great, but
yeah, I don't think it's great either. But I don't think people are going to be able to resist like and just check back, tens plus here on the river. I'm really really counting on that. I actually feel pretty good about that. And the other thing that I'm hoping is that I didn't polarize enough on the turn to get those hands to like really think about like, have the thought process that you just had where it's like, well, they polarized on the turn and they check the river. Do I really want to like reopen the action with jacks? I felt like betting 70 on the turn kind of might let me like slide under the radar a little bit, or might make them think like, oh, hey, maybe, the big blind was just betting pocket fours or pocket fives or, king three on the turn for protection or whatever. So I was hoping like the 75% on the turn would kind of, give me a little bit of credit in that sense. So basically what I was thinking was like the overpairs, just bet the river and I'm going to be able to check raise. I don't know if they call the check raise, but I'm at least, I think, going to be able to trap a bet. The other part of the range that I'm really excited about checking versus is just their like one diamond hands, again, that we mentioned on the turn, that I was targeting with the 75. I don't know how many of them are going to bet the river. I would think like maybe a hand like ace queen with the queen of diamonds checks back the river, pretty high frequency, but I would guess like a hand like bean jack with the queen of diamonds will bet the river very high frequency. So
I mean,
like
it's hard, right? They open
range.
from low jack. So how many like offsuit non ace high busted diamonds do they have? Like king queen, king jack maybe, and that's really it. I think is for the offsuit ones. So I guess you do get the benefit too of like if they were indeed checking range and they have like a flush or they turn to boat or something like that. Like I guess if they turn to boat, it doesn't matter what you bet, they're probably going to raise. But if you bet like 1.5x here, I don't think a flush raises on the river. I think a flush just calls, or they probably should just call. So you do get the added opportunity of potentially stacking a flush that just didn't see bet the flop, which is again quite a nice bonus. So again, like the water's pretty muddied here as for, in my opinion, as to whether you should bet or check. I guess it's pretty cool to just kind of bank on villain to not take your polarized bet super seriously and not be able to kind of lay off the greed and go for some thin value here when they bet and just kind of bank on that. So you're taking quite a sizable risk here. Like just to be full transparency, there is a giant risk here when you check the river that they check back with tens or jacks, which I think is kind of an unmitigated disaster because you didn't get to place your extra bet. So you take the risk. Villain bets pot on the river, which is probably a good sign. I mean,
please let it be a flush.
Yeah, don't let it be two eights. Rather be a flush. You opt to rip and they fold. So you did trap a bet, and villain had the ace 10 off. I guess that's an ace high with the offsuit ace high. So
one of the really bad ones though. So it's not. Yeah, I don't know how much it matters, but yeah.
I mean, again, like that's a hand that like could probably just check behind, and it doesn't need to bet pot there on the river, but they did, so doesn't matter now. Well done. That's pretty nice, trapping a pot size bet. And so now we're going to move on to the final hand of the day and go through it probably fairly quickly. So let's start here. John's playing 6-handed, 5-10 no limit, 1K and L. The button opens to 25, and John 3-bets to 110 with ace of diamonds, queen of clubs from the small blind. Big blind folds, button calls. Flop is queen 6-6 with the queen 6 of spades. So flush draw available. There's 230 in the pot, and we have decision point number one here. You could bet, you could check, you could use a spectrum of sizes. So what were you thinking?
So this is end of July. So my 3-bet strat, I can tell you exactly what I was thinking here, is to bet half pot on the flop with stronger value like this for sure. Top pair, top kicker, check the turn, and then jam the river. We've done a couple Tactical Tuesdays episode where I took that exact line, and I think a couple of the hands I was like actually shocked by how light I was getting called down. So that was almost certainly my value strategy, or my just kind of my strategy with this hand in that spot is half pot the flop and check the turn.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you looked at the date and address like kind of the fluidity of strat deployment and strat changes, where I think this is sort of inherent to poker and poker strategy in general, is that the dynamics, the meta, the strategies of the game and the pool that you're playing in are going to change, and you have to be adaptable to changing environments as a poker player. It's just essential. It's an essential trait of playing poker at a very high level, is having fluid strategies that change over time. So yeah, half pot here. There you go, half pot. 230 in the pot, and villain calls. The turn is an ace of hearts, which is a really good card for you, to be honest. Like, for just from villain's perspective, this ace is when you start out with half pot, you're generally not choosing to bucket hands that are ace high into that bucket. So the ace on the turn, demotes like king queen, possibly queen jack, pocket kings from your range. You're probably not doing it with ace king, so you don't have that. So yeah, I think the player on the button who calls likely has more ace X than you. So anyway, just long-winded way of me saying that, like, I think this is a great card, not for your range, but for you as a human being and getting paid downstream. I think it's a really good card. And I imagine that you're just going to check because that's the most natural, clean option. You check, and villain checks behind, which again is totally reasonable. And the river is the jack of clubs. So final board is ace, queen, jack, 6-6, no flush available, and you have top two pair. Yeah, so I guess we'll start here on the river. Villain has 777 behind. You've got there's 456 in the pot, and you've got them covered.
I started this hand out by saying that I'm surprised by how light I get called in the spot, which probably means I should lean towards just jamming here. I don't know if this particular run out changes your mind at all.
It doesn't seem super conducive to getting paid super light. Yeah, like right, triple Broadway run out. Like any of the hands that you kind of could have started with on the flop that were like low equity kind of picked up some equity. Like the jack in particular, if you have like king 10, that's a straight, jack 10, that's a pair, king jack, that's a pair. So those hands typically check the river and don't jam the river, which makes it tricky. I think getting paid at a high frequency by villains bluff catchers. With that said, man, I don't know. I think it's like, I think I would probably just check here and hope that villain can jam with a hand like 7s or 8s and kind of turn a pair into a bluff. I just suspect that on this specific run out, villain starts chucking a bunch of their available bluff catchers, and they can value bet an ace too, right? Like they can value bet an ace versus the double check, especially after 50%ing the flop, and then you can kind of go from there, whether or not you want to check raise or not. But intuitively, I lean towards just checking the river and letting villain place a bet somehow.
Yeah, I do end up checking the river. My thought process was something along the lines of like the bluff catchers that also like, I don't think there's like this huge bluff catching region for me to target here. And I think a lot of the hands that do bluff catch just are going to be really tempted to bet the river themselves, mostly the ace X that you mentioned. Again, I think this is a spot where I don't think most players are going to have I don't even know if discipline is the right word, but I don't think they're going to have enough discipline to like check back ace 5 of spades on the river or something.
I don't think they should check back ace 5 of spades. I think like just checking in this situation. I think discipline's not the right word. I just think like strategically they just should value bet ace 5 because you just should. It's just you're pushing equity versus the double check basically, and the paired with the 50% size C bet, where you're going to have just a bunch of like single paired hands that they can get value against, and really their primary threat is ace king, which you probably don't start out betting 50% on the flop with ace king, so you can remove that threat pretty quickly.
Yeah. So the hands that I think that will call a big value bet on the river, I think likely just value bet themselves. And so the extra like bonus region that I'm trying to capture value from by checking the spot is just their like total air. And maybe
busted
sometimes they're
spades.
seven. Yeah. Or maybe they're like sevens and eights, like you said, that just like, try to get us
Sure.
to fold king, queen, or queen, jack, or pocket king or something like that.
Right.
On the river. So yeah, that's sort of what I was hoping for on the river. But yeah, I do agree with you that this does feel like just a natural spot to check.
Right. With that said, villain bets 3/4, so 456 in the pot. They bet 298.
Is jamming automatic?
Man, another really tricky node as to whether or not you should jam. I think that. Yeah, I think it's probably automatic. Just kind of looking at it and eyeballing it, like it feels like if villain, it just feels like villain may have like an all-in size and a 3/4 pot size, and the all-in size is gonna contain probably a fair amount of their like jacks full, and probably a fair amount of their like trips, or sometimes like some kind of straight, like backdoor straight type combo, king 10, like king 10 of clubs or something like that. So with that said, like I think you probably do have to jam, or you should jam. But I'm basing that analysis on like the fact that I think villain is probably has two different sizes here. I don't know that villain has two different sizes here, and that's sort of, kind of there's room for interpretation here. Like we're kind of making an assumption, or I'm kind of making an assumption by giving that analysis. But I do think your hand, I think you can probably jam. I think it's safe enough to just rip.
Well, there's only one way to find out if villain has two sizes.
Yep. That is by ripping yourself. So villain bet 300, John jammed for 782, and villain folded. So that's pretty nice.
Probably has two sizes.
Let's just hope they have the 4 or 5 of spades. So the busted flush draw. Yeah. So probably we have no idea. We can't learn. We can't really learn anything from them having 5 high, because we don't know. But hopefully they do. Hopefully, and either way, it's good for your red line. Just ripping it in there. So there you go. That's going to do it for today's episode. These are good hands, and yeah, it's good to see. I don't think we had any incidents today, did we? No incidents?
Yeah, actually everything worked out. The bluffs bluffed when we checked to them, and the value accidentally owned itself, the 9-8, the first hand. So
I think you're finally catching on that all you have to do is bring in hands where things work out well, and you don't have incidents here on Tactical Tuesday. You just now learned that you can game the system. Well done, John. Well done.
Those hands are hard to find.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. And I don't have anything else for you this week.
See you next week.
Peace.
Thanks for listening to Chasing Poker Greatness. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcast app. Go to chasingpokergreatness.com to get the newsletter, join the Greatness Village community, book a coaching session, or dive into the latest data-driven poker courses. Follow the show on Twitter @CPG Podcast.